This is the contemporary European security system, and this is class number 9, and we're going to be talking about. And the first slide shows a map of those countries which currently possess nuclear weapons. These include the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states. So here we have the United States, which according to this map from the Arms Control Association has just over 6,000 nuclear warheads under its control. The next largest nuclear power obviously is Russia. These were the 2 Cold War superpowers, obviously. And it too has just over, or about 6,500 nuclear warheads. China, about 290, the 3rd recognized nuclear power. And then Britain and France, between them 200 and 300 warheads, respectively. The reason I say these are the 5 recognized nuclear powers is that the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was an international treaty which was designed to control the spread of nuclear weapons. When this treaty is signed in 1968, there were already 5 states which were in possession of nuclear weapons, and the treaty basically recognizes these 5 as being nuclear powers. And these countries were allowed to retain their nuclear arsenals, although in the treaty they promised that they would negotiate in good faith to reduce and perhaps eventually eliminate their nuclear arsenals. Obviously, the treaty was signed in 1968, and so we are still waiting for all these weapons to be dismantled. Although that said, it should be noted that both the United States and the Soviet Union have very substantially reduced their nuclear arsenals. I mean, they still have a lot, but during the Cold War, they had many, many more. So there has been some significant movement in the direction of arms reductions on the part of America and Russia. Aside from the 5 recognized powers, there is then Israel, which according to this data has 90 nuclear warheads. In fact, I don't think Israel has ever admitted to being a nuclear power. So I think this is more, the number of warheads that it has in its possession is more of a guess than something that we can know for certain. India and Pakistan, which are not currently part of the non-proliferation regime. They are not signatories to the non-proliferation treaty. Both of them have developed nuclear weapons, 140, 160. And then, of course, there is North Korea. Again, its nuclear project is shrouded in secrecy, but the map here indicating that the North Koreans probably have something in the region of about 30 nuclear warheads, obviously devoting significant efforts to increasing that number. So these are the group of countries which are currently weapons. Of course, you have other countries like Iran, which have certainly in the past aspired to become nuclear powers. And we'll talk a little bit about Iran and negotiations with Iran later. Another country worth mentioning passing was Libya under Colonel Gaddafi, which also had a nuclear program, which they disbanded at the beginning of the 21st century. South Africa as well also at one time had a nuclear bomb. But South Africa is interesting because it's one of the few countries in the world which have actually fully denuclearized. So the South African bomb was dismantled, I think, after the apartheid regime fell at the beginning of the 1990s. Now, nuclear weapons are one of a kind of weapons which have been sort of generally classified as weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. So you have nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and biological weapons, and these weapons all kind of come under this general category of weapons of mass destruction. And over the years, we've seen several international treaties and conventions which have been designed to limit the spread of these types of weapons. Probably the most famous, and actually I think to date reasonably effective international treaty was the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty. And those countries which have signed it, aside from the 5 recognised nuclear powers, but those countries which have signed it, which is most of the international community, some countries have signed it and then withdrawn. North Korea comes into this category. But most of the international community have signed this treaty, and essentially, by signing it, they have forsworn developing their own nuclear weapons. As I say, the treaty was signed in 1968. Back then, there were 5 recognised nuclear powers. And looking at the map today, what is quite apparent is that actually, we're talking, what is it now? Over 50 years later. Since then, only 3 or 4 other countries have joined the club. So Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea. So actually, this has been relatively successful. There hasn't been too much of a spread. And I think there are a number of factors related to that. Not least is that it remains technically very, very challenging to produce a usable nuclear weapon. Not only is it challenging to actually kind of produce a warhead, which would create the explosion, but also a delivery system. So what I mean by that is the missile and the other instruments. So for that reason, as much as anything, I think it has resulted in a relatively slow spread of nuclear weapons. Non-Proliferation Treaty, 1968. A few years later, there was a Biological Weapons Convention, Chemical Weapons Convention. There have, over the years, been several test ban treaties as well, resulting in the mid-1990s, there was a comprehensive test ban treaty. That relates to the testing of nuclear weapons. And then various arms control agreements. I've got here 2 of the most significant, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties in 1972, 79. Since then, I haven't put them on there, but I should have done actually. We could add the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, first of which was negotiated in the 1980s, but there have been a couple since then as well. So as I said, there have been various international treaties and conventions which have actually tried to limit the spread of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. In terms of European security, the first thing to note is, again, as the map showed, there are a couple of European states which do actually possess weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons. So both Britain and France are self-proclaimed nuclear powers. So in that sense, Europe, or at least 2 countries within Europe, I say Europe, but you could add Russia to the list if we include Russia as a European power. But 2 countries, let's say Western Europe, as I say, are proclaimed nuclear powers in their own right. In general, though, I think the European Union, in several documents relating to European security strategy, the EU has actually very publicly declared that the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is viewed as a major security problem. So the EU has sort of committed itself to combating the spread of WMDs. There are a number of reasons why the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction could be regarded as being a threat from the point of view of European states. First, and perhaps most obviously, there is a general fear that a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear missile, something like that, could actually be used against Europe or one or several European states. One example would be Iran. If Iran were to develop a sort of medium range missile armed with a nuclear warhead, then it could conceivably reach at least some European states in the towards the southern or eastern parts of Europe. So there's an obvious concern about the spread of nuclear weapons, particularly into the Middle East, Near East, North Africa, these sorts of areas, regions which are geographically not that far away from Europe. So that's one potential threat. Probably relatively unlikely for the foreseeable future that a state in Europe's immediate neighbourhood might acquire such a capability, but that obviously is something that Europeans have to be relatively concerned about. A second point which Coty makes in his book, in his chapter, he talks about the idea that of European forces in out-of-area missions, out-of-area meaning beyond Europe itself. So we could be talking about peacekeeping missions in other parts of the world. We could be talking about some kind of military intervention in East Asia or the Middle East, and the possibility that these states might come under attack from some kind of weapon of mass destruction, whether a small nuclear bomb or chemical weapons or something like that. And actually, of course, one of the reasons why countries like Korea are quite keen to develop these weapons is that they believe that if North Korea actually were to possess a nuclear weapon, there's a general feeling that other states, the United States, the international community would be very, very unlikely to intervene militarily against it. Then there are the possibility of terrorist groups getting their hands on weapons of mass destruction, particularly chemical and biological weapons. As we've already noted, developing nuclear weapons is a very costly and technically challenging exercise. But a more likely scenario is a terrorist organization coming to acquire chemical and biological weapons. In fact, we have seen attacks using both chemical and biological weapons in different parts of the world. A Japanese cult/terrorist group in the 1990s spread sarin gas on the Japanese subway, underground railway. After the 9/11 attacks, anthrax spores were spread across one or two cities in the United States. They didn't actually, anthrax being a biological disease, they didn't actually spread, and there weren't that many casualties as a result of it. But nonetheless, there was an effort by a group to do that. Another factor which causes Europeans concern is the idea that the weapons of mass destruction taboo, this idea, I think taboo is the same word in Polish, isn't it? This idea, though, that states don't want nuclear weapons or chemical weapons because they are sort of unacceptable in the eyes of other countries. But there's a feeling that if more and more countries were to acquire weapons, that taboo could over time be eroded. So one example might be if Iran were to acquire a usable nuclear device, then other countries in the Middle East, most notably its main rival in the region, Saudi Arabia, would almost certainly want to do the same. So there's a feeling as the spread of nuclear weapons increases, then, as I say, this idea of a taboo, this idea that these weapons are in some way unacceptable, that could actually erode, that could actually weaken over time, and other countries might also decide that they wanted similar weapons. Then the possibility terrorist groups could also come into possession of weapons of mass destruction. So it's not just states, as we mentioned a moment ago, particularly I think chemical and biological weapons. Certainly Al-Qaeda in the 2000s made it clear that they had an aspiration to acquire some kind of nuclear capability. So yeah, for all these reasons, Europeans have to take the spread of weapons of mass destruction seriously. However, it's quite interesting that when you contrast European attitudes with that of the United States, in general, I think the Europeans have been less concerned about proliferation of weapons of mass destruction than America, which in some ways is surprising because Europeans are geographically much closer to various states which have either attempted to develop weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, or perhaps do actually possess them. So despite the Europeans' geographical proximity, for the most part, as I say, they have been less concerned or less fearful about the spread of weapons than the United States. Possibly that is a consequence of the 9/11 attacks in the United States. Although, as I say, although the Europeans are geographically closer to some of these countries which are trying to develop these kinds of weapons, the United States is the one country in the world that has actually experienced mass casualties in a terrorist attack. Now, obviously, 9/11, the terrorists didn't use weapons of mass destruction, but they did suffer. They did create an awful lot of destruction and carnage, killed a lot of people. So I think that perhaps, as much as anything, explains why the United States takes the issue of proliferation perhaps slightly more seriously in some ways than their European counterparts. That said, as we've just noted, the Europeans certainly do consider proliferation to be a significant security challenge with which they are having to deal. And in terms of the European response, I think it's fair to say that the Europeans in general have viewed the best instrument for managing this problem as being sort of multilateral agreements on arms control or arms reduction. So Europeans have generally supported the idea, as I say, of international agreements, using diplomacy, persuasion, in order to get various states to comply with this idea that they should either refrain from developing weapons of mass destruction, or that they should dismantle any programs or any weapons that are currently in their possession. So European states I think all European states are signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they have been generally supportive of it. Then you've had the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty signed in 1996, although that still has not actually come into force. It requires a certain number of states to actually sign it, and not all of them actually have. One problem with these sorts of treaties, though, is the issue of verification and enforcement. Verification meaning how do you know that countries are actually complying with what the treaties should say that they have been doing, and enforcement. How if a country breaks the treaty or doesn't comply fully with what the treaty requires, how do you actually enforce it? There was a good example of this a couple of years ago when the United States, under President Trump, withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which Reagan had signed with Gorbachev, arguing that the Soviet Union was no longer really complying with it, that the Soviet Union was actually Russia, I should say, that Russia was actually breaking these these agreements. So, similarly, in the case of Iraq, there was the issue of weapons inspectors, the international community. Iraq in the 2000s, under Saddam Hussein, there was the question of how did you know whether or not Iraq was sort of complying with its obligations to end its nuclear program, and a long-running dispute between Iraq and various other countries over the admission of weapons inspectors and things like that. So verification and enforcement, as I say, is a continuing area for these sorts of treaties. As I mentioned earlier, Non-Proliferation Treaty does recognise 5 nuclear weapons states, 2 of which are European. So, as I say, Europe itself has 2 nuclear powers. And then there's the issue, I suppose, of where sort of Britain and France sit in the international community's efforts for arms control. I think most European states are sort of supportive of the idea of nuclear disarmament. However, the British and the French have been more reluctant to sort of participate in this process. While there have certainly been reductions in the number of warheads that the British and the French have had, British and French are in possession of since the end of the Cold War, obviously they have many fewer warheads than the United States or Russia, and I think the position of the British and the French governments is that they are unwilling to significantly reduce their number of warheads much further. And to a certain extent then, other European states, I mean, until recently, of course, Britain was an EU member. Other European states have generally, in terms of the kind of EU's foreign and security policies, are kind of reflecting more the British and the French position. So the EU hasn't very strongly supported international disarmament measures which have actually included European states themselves. Another potential security problem that Europeans face is, as Coty puts it in his book, loose nukes. That is, how do you account for all the nuclear weapons which are in Europe and in other parts of the world? This was a particularly acute problem when the Soviet Union broke up at the end of 1991. The Soviet Union obviously had a vast number of nuclear weapons. And these weapons were sort of dispersed right across the various republics in the Soviet Union. So they weren't all in Russia, but there were many in Ukraine, Georgia, other countries in the region. So one major challenge that the international community and the Europeans especially sort of faced in the 1990s was first of all, how did you needed to find out where all these weapons were and then account for them and then sort of bring them all under some kind of control. As I say, it affected Europeans and the United States. But the point that Coty makes in his book is that it was actually the United States that played a leading role in managing this problem. It's the United States that launches a comprehensive threat reduction initiative in the early 1990s, and that basically involves sending people into the various Soviet republics, find where these weapons were, begin the process of dismantling them, and basically helping to draw up agreements with the various post-Soviet republics and Russia when it came to actually transferring these weapons back into Russian control. And the statistics Coty gives in his book is that between 1992 and 2002, the United States spends about $5 billion on this. In contrast, the EU only spends about $369 million. After 9/11, the G8, this is the 7 industrialized countries, so European, Japan, Canada, the United States. They announced a global partnership against the spread of weapons and materials of mass destruction. This partnership was more equal. I can't remember the exact figures in terms of money spent, but between them, the United States and the EU spent more or less the same in terms of trying to manage this problem. But yeah, as Cotti said, it's quite striking that it is the United States that is in the lead in this position, not least because obviously Europe itself was in much closer geographical proximity to the old Soviet Union. So one would think that the Europeans might have had, might have played a greater role. Perhaps this was a sort of reflection, if you like, of the weakness of the EU's kind of common and foreign security policies in the 90s, that a stronger role in all of this. Then we have the issue of how the EU has managed its relations with those countries which are either have declared or at least are suspected of trying to develop weapons of mass destruction, particularly countries with nuclear programs. And the two most obvious examples are Iran and North Korea. And essentially, in terms of how you deal with these countries, as I say, the second point there says there's a sort of debate about the best instruments. Do you try and use some kind of coercive instruments against them to try and deter them from developing weapons of mass destruction, or do you actually try and engage with them diplomatically and try and persuade them to relinquish their nuclear programs? I think it's fair to say, well, first of all, if you look at various individual cases, the record is somewhat mixed. In the case of some countries, the international community, including the European Union, have engaged with them. In other cases, the international community has applied various sort of coercive instruments to try and manage these relations. In general, though, I think it's fair to say that most European countries have tended to prefer engagement as opposed to coercion. As I said, the record's mixed, but I think when you compare the European position with that of the United States, I think it's fair to say that the Europeans have been much more willing to use diplomacy in managing various cases than their American counterparts. There's a couple of examples. There are a couple of examples on the slide here. It mentions here Iraq, which after the first Gulf War in 1991 and as part of the peace agreements between Iraq and the international community, Saddam Hussein's government had to dismantle its nuclear program. And various sanctions were imposed on Iraq when it became clear that Iraq, or at least Iraq, seemed to be sort of avoiding these sorts of various obligations. So economic sanctions, in particular, were imposed on Iraq. After the 2003 war, when Iraq was occupied by the United States and other countries as well, including Britain and Poland, for that matter, it became clear that Iraq did not actually possess weapons of mass destruction, which was rather embarrassing to the Bush administration and to the British government that had insisted that Iraq did actually have these weapons. So there has been a lot of debate about the effectiveness of the various sanctions which were applied to Iraq in the 1990s in terms of forcing Iraq to stop its nuclear program. In the case of North Korea, the Clinton administration did actually initially use diplomacy with North Korea in 1994. There was an international agreement in which sanctions against North Korea would be relaxed. Some kind of aid and assistance was given in North Korea. In return, the North Koreans agreed to end their nuclear program. As we mentioned earlier, the problems with North Korea came down to sort of verification and enforcement. There were doubts about whether the North Korean government was actually living up to its obligations. When the Bush administration came in, and especially after the 9/11 attacks in 2001, The Bush administration actually withdrew from this agreement and actually threatened to actually militarily intervene against North Korea. It has been suggested, I read not long ago, that the North Korean government was genuinely quite concerned in 2002, 2003 that the United States might actually launch some kind of military intervention, that they might actually work to overthrow the communist government. And therefore, the regime might have actually been willing to enter into a more kind of comprehensive agreement. In the event, that didn't happen, and of course, in 2006, North Korea actually detonated its first nuclear weapon, and today it's widely acknowledged that it has kind of developed into a nuclear power. Libya is another interesting example. In the 1980s and 1990s, Libya under Colonel Gaddafi did actually have a nuclear program. Beginning of the 2000s, again, I think shortly after 9/11 and the global war on terror, the government there eventually decided to abandon its nuclear program. Again, this was partly as a consequence of sort of international pressure, also diplomatic engagement with Libya. But of course, a few years later, Gaddafi himself is overthrown. With the Arab Spring in 2011, NATO actually intervenes against Libya in 2011. So I think one lesson that other authoritarian leaders have drawn from this is that actually it is better to have nuclear weapons. I think North Korea is looking at the fate of, Kim Il-jong in North Korea is sort of looking at the fate of Gaddafi and thinking, well, actually, we need to have nuclear weapons because we want to avoid the same thing happening to us as happened to Gaddafi a few years earlier. So yeah, you could look at the case of Libya and argue that relinquishing nuclear weapons or abandoning a nuclear program might one day lead to some form of Western intervention. There's been a debate about the most effective instruments to use when trying to prevent proliferation. And broadly, I suppose there are three potential instruments. One is sort of diplomatic pressure. So various governments in the international community engaging with a problem country or rogue state, if you like, and applying pressure in order to try and persuade it to abandon its nuclear aspirations. Another more concrete form of pressure would be economic sanctions, or finally, possibly using some form of military intervention to destroy weapons facilities, research facilities, things like that. On diplomatic pressure, well, diplomatic pressure, as I say there, is unlikely to be effective on its own. So unless diplomacy is sort of backed up with some other form of pressure. That said, coordinated pressure does seem to have some kind of influence. I think we'll talk a little bit about the Iran agreement in a moment, but when the Obama administration was trying to kind of cut a deal with Iran, the fact that virtually all of the international community wanted Iran to actually abandon its nuclear program, including countries like Russia and China, that I think did actually make a difference. Economic sanctions, which are sort of routinely, I suppose, imposed upon those states which publicly declare that they have nuclear ambitions. The problem with sanctions, though, is often they take a very long time to work, indeed if they work at all. And furthermore, if you start imposing economic sanctions, then the people you are hurting are the population living inside the country, and it can mean the economy deteriorates, conditions in the country deteriorate. For example, in the case of Iraq in the 90s, economic sanctions applied to Iraq meant that a lot of Iraqi children suffered because of the rather poor economic condition in the country. So economic sanctions, as I say, there's a debate about their effectiveness, and obviously the consequences can be pretty bad for some people living in those countries. The final option is sort of some kind of military force used against the state. And I think it's fair to say that the Bush administration after 2002 came to embrace this idea. And in fact, of course, they used it against Iraq in 2003. The justification for going to war against Iraq in 2003 was to try and bring to an end Iraq's status as a country which possessed weapons of mass destruction. As I said earlier, when you compare American attitudes with European attitudes, I think it's fair to say that the EU has tended to prefer engagement as opposed to coercion when dealing with these sorts of cases. The EU was part of a sanctions regime against Iraq in the 1990s. When the United States did decide to go to war against Iraq, we talked about this before, I think, but when the United States does decide to launch a war against Iraq in 2003 to deal with the weapons of mass destruction problem, the European Union was actually pretty divided. Some countries within the European Union were pretty supportive of the American operation, notably the British, who actually sent troops to fight in Iraq as well. Poland, again, a similar case. Other countries, notably Germany and France, were very much against this intervention. Then you've got Russia, and I think the Russian attitude is rather more sort of ambivalent, and I think Coty makes this point. Russia generally shares the West's interest in not wanting to see the spread of weapons of mass destruction to other areas of the world, especially the Middle East. On the other hand, Russia has been quite keen to prevent an expansion of Western interests, and in some cases, such as especially North Korea, but also Iran, Russia has been somewhat reluctant to support Western efforts because there's been a general feeling that maybe the West is trying to expand its influence into these regions. In the case of Iraq, again, Russia was against the Bush administration's decision to topple Saddam Hussein's regime. Again, the concern inside Russia was that this was a case of the United States expanding, projecting its influence into an area which was thought to be geopolitically quite important. Russia against weapons of mass destruction, but also, as I say, wanting to limit American influence. And so it's generally the Russians have not military actions against these states. Now, Coty doesn't actually talk much about the Iran nuclear. He doesn't talk anything about the Iran nuclear deal because the book was published before that came through. But at the time, you deal with Iran, which the Obama administration negotiates, I think in 2015, was viewed as very much a success in terms of diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and I suppose also the potential threat of military force. After years of negotiations and the fact that relations between the two countries historically have been very, very difficult. Finally, an agreement was actually reached whereby the Iranians basically promised not to pursue their nuclear ambitions. And the photograph here is an illustration of the number of countries which were actually involved in this. You've got, I think these are the various foreign ministers. So the Chinese foreign minister, French foreign minister, Germany. This was the then European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Federico Mogherini. The Iranian foreign minister, obviously, Russian, That doesn't look like the foreign minister. Lavrov is the foreign minister. That's not him. Okay, anyway. That's certainly the British Foreign Secretary, and John Kerry, the American Secretary of State. So that gives you an indication of the various parties which were involved in this agreement. So yeah, it was basically the P5 being the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council: Britain, France, Russia, China, and the United States. His head, trying to remember the fifth. Plus one. The plus one is Germany. So all these countries were involved, and the European Union as well, in the shape of the EU High Representative of Foreign Affairs. So it was a kind of collective international effort, and in many ways, was a triumph for diplomacy. I think it was seen as quite a significant diplomatic accomplishment of the Obama administration, not least because the Obama administration had managed to bring to bear sustained international pressure against Iran. As I say, it's quite notable that even countries like Russia and China were part of this process. As part of the deal, Iran was required to give up most of its enriched uranium. Uranium needs to be enriched in order to turn it into a usable atomic weapon. Most of Iran's research facilities were to be shut down. A very intense international verification. So this was extremely intrusive, and an intense international verification system was to be implemented. And in return, the international community would basically bring to an end economic sanctions against Iran. So it was quite, at the time it was seen as quite a significant agreement. The problem within the United States was that one of the two main parties, the Republican Party, was pretty much opposed to the agreement from the beginning. They did not like the idea that the United States was sitting down and negotiating with one of America's historic enemies. One consequence of that is that the deal was never became formally an international treaty, which was voted on in the Senate. The other consequence is that when the Obama administration leaves office and a Republican president, Donald Trump, comes to power, his administration was pretty much against the treaty from the beginning. Although, interestingly, a number of figures involved in the Trump administration, although they had opposed the treaty when the Obama administration had negotiated it, when they looked at the details, I think this included people like the Defense Secretary, Mattis, when they looked at the details, they felt that actually the United States should actually remain part of the agreement. The problem was Trump, who had been opposed to the Iran agreement from the beginning, wasn't happy with it and announced a couple of years ago that the United States would actually withdraw. And that led to quite a public schism between the United States and the European Union. So the United States withdrew, but the EU did not follow suit. So most all European countries still the treaty. They refused to impose more sanctions against Iran. And I think EU diplomacy has been quite active when working with the Iranian government in an effort to try and persuade the Iranians to comply with the agreement, despite the fact that the United States has withdrawn. The problem is, though, that the Iranian government seems to be sort of moving in a direction in which they are actually withdrawing from parts of the agreement. So ultimately, it could well be that the Trump administration's decision to withdraw might well lead to the agreement's collapse. Nonetheless, as I say, I think the Iranian agreement was interesting because it kind of showed the effectiveness, I think, of collective international diplomacy and pressure in terms of actually bringing a country like Iran to the negotiating table. So yeah, Iran sort of offers an example of what, for a moment at least, seemed to be a successful case of international diplomacy. From the European perspective, though, I think there's also a general feeling that countries are going to have to learn to live with proliferation. And we've already, when we looked at our map at the beginning, we already noted that there were at least 3 states, was it 4 states, which have acquired nuclear weapons since the signing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think it's fair to say almost inevitably there will be several more states are likely to join the nuclear club in the next 10 or 20 years or so. 2 of the most concerning cases would be India and Pakistan, for a number of reasons. Partly as an issue of nuclear safety. These countries are, these are 2 relatively poor countries, especially Pakistan. And I think there are kind of major concerns about the security of their sort of nuclear installations. There are fears that maybe a terrorist group could get their hands on a nuclear warhead or something like that. But as I say, their acquisition of nuclear weapons shows that some level of proliferation is inevitable. In terms of dealing with external nuclear threats, Europeans and the United States have historically relied very heavily on this idea of deterrence. So this idea that a country won't attack you with its nuclear weapons if you have nuclear weapons, because you will use them in return. So deterrence, as I say, there has been the main rationale for European states to possess nuclear weapons. And I think it's fair to say that British and French nuclear weapons are generally viewed as some sort of wider European umbrella, that that British and French nuclear weapons are there to defend not just themselves but other European states as well. From time to time, there has been a discussion of converting the British and French nuclear deterrence into some wider European nuclear force. So instead of having 2 European countries in possession of these weapons, turning them into, as I say, into, if you like, a sort of European nuclear force. The problem, though, is that neither the British nor the French have been particularly interested in this idea. So the idea that the EU as a whole, that seems a fairly unlikely scenario, not least, of course, because Britain has now actually withdrawn from the European Union. There's also the question that Cotti touches upon about the idea of some kind of missile defense system. The EU as a whole has not really been that interested in developing its own defense system as such. I think for several reasons, but not least, I think there are strong doubts about whether a defense system would actually be kind of usable or technically viable. On the other hand, American administrations, various American administrations, especially the Bush administration from 2001 to 2009, was quite keen on missile defense systems, and some European countries, including Poland and the Czech Republic, were actually invited to contribute to kind of participate within this sort of wider European defense system. In Cotti's sort of concluding points, he makes the argument, and we sort of mentioned it earlier, that if kind of nuclear proliferation does kind of continue and spreads into Asia, Middle East, perhaps other parts of the world as well, it will almost certainly make it more difficult for the United States and European states to intervene in other parts of the world. I mentioned Libya earlier, and the fact that other countries have looked at what happened to Colonel Gaddafi. That he abandoned Libya's nuclear program, and then a few years later his regime collapsed, partly as a consequence of a NATO intervention. So in some ways, I think that will almost certainly have strengthened the desire on the part of other authoritarian regimes, to particularly, I think, North Korea, to develop their own nuclear deterrence, to try and make sure there isn't some kind of international intervention against them. But the general point I made earlier, yes, Europeans have tended to prefer to use diplomatic instruments when managing the problem of proliferation. And And of course, as I say, there are 3 European states which are recognized nuclear powers: Britain, France, and Russia. None of them seem to take keen on the idea of dismantling or even significantly reducing their nuclear deterrence. And given that these 3 European countries possess nuclear weapons, it will make it kind of quite difficult, I think, for other states like North Korea to be persuaded to relinquish their own nuclear arsenals, or even to persuade some countries from actually developing their own nuclear programs. As I said, I mean, if Iran were to become a nuclear power, then I think it's almost inevitable that Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region might well follow suit. So, as I say, this lack of wider international disarmament means that probably some degree of proliferation will almost certainly kind of continue in the years